Spain are very quickly proving to have one of the most interesting tactical systems at this Euros that can adapt to the opponent and find weaknesses in their defensive system. And last night against Italy, there was no competition, with Spain completely suffocating them in their own half. Let's take a look. If it wasn't for an extremely impressive performance by Donnarumma in goal, the scoreline could have been much more in favour of this Spanish team, with a standout individual performance by Nico Williams on the left flank. And we're going to be taking a look at how Spain were able to exploit a weakness in Italy's defensive structure. So while both teams started the match in a 4-3-3, in reality Spain were in possession for the vast majority of the match, especially in the first half, and then a little bit less towards the end of the match when Italy tried to push forward a little bit more frequently. But the reason why Spain are so good at controlling the tempo of the match and controlling possession in the first phase of build-up is because of the position of the fullbacks. Now, this worked well against Croatia, but it worked especially well against Italy last night. And the fullbacks in Spain's system are used very deep and very wide to create essentially a back four defensive line that they can use to circulate possession and make it very difficult for the defending team to close down the players that have the ball. Now, they were able to exploit this against Croatia for a reason that we'll look at in a minute, but against Italy, what Spalletti wanted them to do was press man for man in the first phase of build-up. So the first issue was that Scamacca was in a 2v1 against the centre-backs, and so they pushed Frattesi up on the second centre-back to try and even out this position. But then you'd have either Jorginho or Barella trying to pick up Rodri in the centre, and then Chiesa and Pellegrini would push out wide to cover the fullbacks. And this essentially meant that either Jorginho or Barella was in a 2v1 against Fabian Ruiz or Pedri in the middle. Now, the way Italy wanted to level out these numbers as well was by breaking the defensive line. This is a concept that is obviously very common at all leagues and all levels, but in Italy it's especially used, and it's something that I've heard Italian managers talk about a lot. This concept of breaking the defensive line to level out the numbers in the middle. And Italy, in this case, they did it with Calafiori pushing up onto Pedri. Now, this did leave a lot of space at the back, and it essentially left the back line in a 3v3 with Williams, Morata and Yamal. So when Italy were in this aggressive man-for-man pressing phase, Spain didn't need to build from the back, and they exploited this massive space between the lines really, really effectively. And this was down to some excellent hold-up play by Morata, especially in the first half, able to knock it down between the lines, and then from this position, Spain had the advantage of moving it out wide and having wingers that could be very efficient in a 1v1, especially Nico Williams against Di Lorenzo on the left flank. I don't think Di Lorenzo won a single tackle against Nico Williams last night. He was unstoppable, and it was the majority of the way Spain looked to create their chances. So we can see how these long balls were dangerous for Italy to deal with because Spain were able to create a lot of space between the lines. So for the vast majority of the time, Italy didn't want to press this aggressively during the match. So they did adopt a slightly more passive 4-1-4-1, but the main issue still arises when you consider the position of the fullbacks when Spain have possession further up the pitch, because Cucurella and Carvajal are still hugging the touchline. So if Italy still wanted to close out these players, which they did want to do, you'd have Chiesa moving out wide and Pellegrini moving out wide. And here is where you see the major issue in this pressing shape, because it left these massive spaces that Spain were able to exploit with a number of different players and combinations. And it was really interesting to see how they could adapt to this depending on the opponent. Now, these spaces, as we mentioned earlier, were dangerous against Croatia as well. But against Croatia, Spain went about it in a different way. So for example, against Croatia, Fabian Ruiz would drop into this space, they'd play it here, and then they'd look to switch into the opposite flank. So you'd get a lot of balls played into this position, and then Spain were very confident in playing these diagonals into the wingers. In the first match, Yamal was maybe a little bit more dangerous than Nico Williams, but in this match, the left flank was a lot more dangerous. However, against Italy, they weren't too reliant on switching play too consistently, and they were much more comfortable just playing on the side of the ball. And they did this with the two midfielders being very, very dynamic in their position as well. So even if the ball was on this position on the left, Pedri was very comfortable moving over. Morata would move over, and you'd get a lot of overloads in this position. So essentially, because the fullbacks are used in a deep position and Italy wanted to go man for man, it created these massive channels that Spain exploited in different ways. Again, like we said, mostly on the left flank, but they did exploit this on the right flank as well. And we'll get some examples of what this looked like during the match, but essentially the position of Chiesa and Pellegrini caused a lot of issues because it always left the fullbacks isolated in a 1v1. And if you're in a 1v1 against Nico Williams or Yamal, it's going to be very difficult to defend against. But then even as Spain gained more control of the match, and a lot of the times we saw Spain controlling the tempo in Italy's half, completely compressing Italy's defense into their own box or just outside their own box. From Spain, again, the position of the fullbacks was really, really dangerous. For example, when the ball went out to Cucurella and then went forward into Nico Williams, Cucurella would often push forward and attack the half space. And we saw a lot of combinations with Nico playing it into Cucurella here, who could then try and cut back across the box. But other times, maybe Cucurella is moved into this position, Nico Williams is in possession is slightly deeper, and you have Fabian Ruiz. Lots of different rotations out wide. If you add Morata to the mix and you add Pedri to the mix, obviously with Rodri as support, there's a reason why Spain were able to control the tempo and suffocate Italy in their own half. And essentially, this was the main way Spain created danger against Italy, because by having Cucurella or Carvajal in a deep position and Italy wanting to press these players down and having a lot of distance to cover, when the ball was finally played out wide, either indirectly by going into center and then going back out wide, there was always a 1v1 out wide. And Nico Williams completely dominated Di Lorenzo, but Di Lorenzo never had cover in the center, because as soon as he would step out, Morata would be on Bastoni, so Bastoni couldn't really push too far out. And then whichever player they wanted would push into this half space. So at times it was Fabian Ruiz, but a lot of the times it was also Cucurella moving into a more central position. And Chiesa would not track back effectively. If we take a look at Spain's goal to make it 1-0, the cross came from the left flank, and you can see that it's a 1v1 in each position, because Nico Williams is in a 1v1 against Di Lorenzo, and Cucurella has taken away the defender. The midfielder has followed him, and so Nico Williams can dribble inside and then deliver a dangerous ball into the box. Then it was a nice flick on from Morata, and then unlucky from Calafiori to knock it into his own goal. There was not much he could do from that position. But I also want to touch on Spain's defensive approach as well, because it's been a key reason why Croatia and Italy haven't been able to mount any successful attacks. And what Spain are doing really, really well is, as a team moves over to one flank, they are completely cutting off a ball back to the opposite flank. So a lot of players are moving over to the position of the ball, with the defenders even being very comfortable pushing forward. And it's proving to be very difficult for whichever team they're facing to find space on the flank where they're trying to build, and they often force the long ball, and Spain are able to win it back. And they're not finding the space to move to the diagonal on the opposite flank, where Spain do leave a lot of space in their press. Croatia had the same situation, where they did have a lot of space to exploit on the opposite flank, but they just weren't able to make it past this Spanish press that did have a lot of players on the side of the ball. So Spain's initial press was really impressive, but when Italy did have the ball and tried to create more structured attacks, their pressing shape was also very aggressive in the deep position. Now, a 4-3-3, you'd often expect them to shift either to a 4-1-4-1 or a 4-5-1, like I have them lined up here. But actually, Spain were very aggressive, and they kept basically to their 4-3-3 without the ball as well. So Nico Williams and Yamal were very aggressive on Italy's back three when they tried to build, and it made it difficult for them to create any dangerous opportunities, because they had a lot of players, and they still outnumbered Italy's midfield two of Jorginho and Barella or Frattesi, depending on which side they wanted to build down. So Italy in possession did want to switch to a 3-2-5 with lots of dynamic runs in this position, and the vast majority of danger came from the left flank, specifically through Di Marco trying to push forward and deliver crosses into the box. It's a position that has always been quite effective for Italy. If you think back to Spinazzola when they won the Euros under Mancini, the left wing-back position has always been quite dangerous, and with Di Marco they are able to create a lot of chances on this flank and deliver the ball into the box. However, again, this 3-2-5 didn't really work too well for them, and they tried to make some changes in the second half, but it didn't really work for them, and again, they weren't able to create any real dangerous opportunities. And this Spanish team is very quickly turning out to be one of my favorites for these Euros. It's a team that I didn't really give too much credit to going into the competition, because there was a lot of positions where I thought there were some weaknesses and maybe a little bit of inexperience, but the tactical system is suiting every single player perfectly, and they're proving to be very, very difficult to break down. But I'm curious to know what you think of this Spanish team, and how far do you think they're going to go in these Euros?